And you say Bekzan is how you pronounce
Yeah,
your name, yeah,
yeah,
Bekzan. I'm just saying it, yeah.
yeah. That
Yeah,
that works.
close enough.
Professor Sandlo, it's a great pleasure to talk with you about energy issues. My aim is to raise the awareness of people about energy challenges in this rapidly changing world, particularly in emerging economies. Hello, I'm Bekjan Alimkulov, a graduate student of SIPA Columbia University. Professor Sandlo has served in senior positions at the White House, State Department, and the U.S. Department of Energy. Professor was also an executive vice president at the World Wildlife Fund. Professor writes and speaks widely on energy and climate policy. You can find links to all works of the professor under this video. Professor Sandlo is a graduate of University of Michigan Law School and Yale College. Professor, I know you usually provide OPDs to the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, and I really appreciate that you agreed to this interview and you are here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Bekzan. I appreciate it.
Professor, can you share your work experience in White House? What were your major responsibilities and in which president's administration did you work?
It was a long time ago that I worked at the White House. I worked there for President Bill Clinton during the 1990s, maybe around the time you were born, Bekzan, so a long time ago. But then I also worked for President Obama when he was in office. For President Clinton at the White House, I worked on our National Security Council staff and on the staff of our Council on Environmental Quality, and my responsibilities were on the issues of energy and environment, and particularly climate change. Um, Al Gore was vice president of the United States, and he was really the leader in our administration on working on this issue. And I worked very closely with him and with the president on the international negotiations at Kyoto that led to the Kyoto Protocol, and then in the follow-up to those to that agreement in additional negotiations. And I also worked on a number of other issues as well.
Great.
Professor, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the whole world is observing historical economical shocks. It's crystal clear that the demand for Russian oil and gas by Europe will further reduce. Oil is fungible and other countries could compensate for emerging demand. However, natural gas delivered from Russia by pipeline cannot be completely substituted in the short term. Now, in retrospect, can you explain what was the rationale for Europe to become overwhelmingly dependent on Russian gas? Why did they not develop any other sources of energy? Because now almost 40% of European demand is fulfilled by Russian gas.
It's a very good question, and I should say the people who could answer that best would be Europeans, not me. But I can offer my opinion just as an observer. I think there were probably two principal reasons that I'm aware of that Europe allowed itself to become so dependent on Russian gas. One is that it was cheap, and the supply was nearby, and they were able to buy on stable and on long-term contracts at relatively favorable prices. Until relatively recently, there's been only very limited supply of liquid natural gas, coming from other locations. So Russian gas was, a nearby cheap and stable source. A second reason was more geopolitical. I think there was a hope that by creating economic interdependence and close working economic relationships, that the Russian government would not pursue action like it has pursued in the Ukraine. That this type of economic interdependence would lead to changes and reforms within Russia that would prevent that. That obviously hasn't happened, but I think that was part of the rationale. But again, I should emphasize, I'm not a European. I can't speak to really what their motivations were, but that's my observation.
Professor, one of your prominent works is a guide to Chinese climate policy. I would like to discuss last year's energy crisis in China. China's dramatic recovery from COVID shock and the inability of energy supplies to keep up has delivered a dramatic jolt to global gas prices. China's economic growth at over 8% in 2021 fired up soaring power demand. China's electricity consumption grew by 10%, which has the fastest annual growth for any major economy in the recorded history of the industry. And the question is how China overcame that challenge.
China's by far the world's largest consumer of coal to start with. China has vast abundant reserves of coal. And for almost every year for the past decade, more than half of the world's coal consumption has taken place in China. China also has very abundant hydropower resources. And actually, I mean, it's led the world in hydropower, and it's, for every one of recent years, led the world in wind and solar power, with massive construction of wind and solar power. Interestingly, in gas, which is what you principally asked about, is an area where China has not really been in the lead historically. China's been underweighted in terms of its natural gas consumption. But in recent years, the Chinese government has been trying to promote gas, both domestic consumption, domestic production, and then as well, it's been looking to replace, the Chinese government has looked to replace the use of coal, particularly in northern China, with the use of natural gas. And it's done that largely for environmental reasons. Coal has been a major source of terrible air pollution in northern China, and natural gas burns much cleaner. One challenge that China faces in this regard is that it has a lot of abundant coal supplies, but doesn't have nearly as abundant domestic natural gas supplies. And so China imports natural gas by pipeline from Central Asia, as you know, from Russia, and then also imports liquid natural gas. So when China has a major economic, recovery coming out of COVID, that's led to growth in imports in a variety of different commodities, including in natural gas, and that has implications for global natural gas markets.
Professor, China has the third largest nuclear power fleet in the world, behind only United States and France. In 2018, 7 of the 9 nuclear power plants in the world that connected to the grid for the first time were in China. Roughly 20% of the nuclear power plants under construction in the world today are also in China. Despite the essential public opposition, the government sets ambitious goals. The question is, what is the role of nuclear power in Chinese net zero plans?
So the Chinese, just to start with, the Chinese government has very ambitious goals for the transition to clean energy. And President Xi Jinping has announced that by 2060, China will be carbon neutral. And that is going to be a huge change in China's energy mix. Right now, it's overwhelmingly reliant on coal. The Chinese government doesn't have an official roadmap for how it's going to get there. So it hasn't yet defined what percentage will be nuclear, what percentage will be renewable. And any plans over that type of period would be subject to change in any event. There have been some think tanks in China that are very closely associated with the government that have done some projections. And those projections provide some role for nuclear power, but a much bigger role for renewable power as China transitions to renewables. The current Chinese 5-year plan, within the 14th 5-year plan, does call for additional construction of nuclear power. So construction will be continuing. So nuclear power has a role in China. I don't think it has a dominant role in comparison to some other energy forms, but other energy generation types. But definitely there's a role, and in fact, just because China is so big, even small percentages of power come from nuclear, it means a lot of total nuclear power capacity. And as you pointed out, in recent years, majorities of the new nuclear power plants in the world have been in China. So I think much of the nuclear power industry in the world is going to be focused on China, likelihood in the next decade. You asked about technologies. The Chinese government has used technologies really from every major exporter of nuclear power in the world. The Chinese government in the past 10 to 20 years has purchased American reactors, Korean reactors, Russian reactors, French reactors, and so it's really, and now is developing its own indigenous technologies as well. There is some work in China on so-called Gen 4 or fourth generation nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, passive safe nuclear reactors. Just like other places in the world, that really hasn't become a dominant technology, but I think there's work underway on that.
So they don't have right now ready solution to construct new power plant by themselves.
I know the Chinese are constructing.
Yeah, absolutely. They're producing their own reactors.
Yes. Some with foreign technologies, but Chinese. Big Chinese construction of nuclear power plants. Yes, absolutely.
Professor, in my country, in Kazakhstan, one of the positive heritage of the Soviet Union was a well-developed energy system with energy generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure. However, more than 30 years have passed and things are changing. Now we need more generations. For me, it seems that the United States had almost the same problem. I mean, the number of power stations stayed stable from the 70s until 1995, because America in the 60s, 70s launched a nuclear power fleet. And until 2000, the United States had enough power reserves. And the question is how the government incentivized investors to finance new power stations in the late 1990s. I think those measures could be helpful for countries with emerging economies, particularly for Kazakhstan.
Well, there's one particular policy tool that I think has been important for financing renewable energy in particular. And I'd like to focus on that in answering your question. And it goes by in English we call it a feed-in tariff, which is a little bit of a confusing name, and I think a better name is a guaranteed price. And this it started in Europe. It's more been used in Europe than the United States. But these guaranteed prices that governments offer have helped in the development of wind power and solar power in particular, because they assure commercial lenders that a project developer will be able to repay debt. And so they've helped the developers of solar and wind power build big projects, because the government guarantees that they can sell their power at a certain price, and then banks will lend on it. And that's made a huge difference, I think, in terms of financing. In the United States, it's a complicated answer because we have a number of different systems for regulating within the United States. And that transition started to happen in the 1990s, which is the period you were talking about. Historically, in the United States, utilities went to government agencies we call public utility commissions, and proposed the construction of a power plant. And the Public Utility Commission approved that and then guaranteed a certain rate of return on all the capital that was invested. And that's a very safe way then for a utility to invest, and it helps to bring private capital into the market, because government agency has just said, if you build a power plant here, we guarantee that you'll get 5, 6, 7, 8% on your money. And that was a typical way of promoting construction in the United States. In the 1990s, we started to deregulate our power markets. Some states retained the system I just described. Others entered into more competitive power markets where there was more risk, but more reward also. So private developers were out there offering greater returns on investments, but without that guaranteed rate. So, and that in some states that helped to bring new power generation into the market. In the United States, we really have never had I don't recall having problems with total amount of electricity generation. If the demand for electricity is there, in the United States, our markets are very good for providing that. We've had other challenges. One of our biggest challenges in the United States has been having adequate transmission capacity. It's very difficult in the United States to build long-distance transmission lines because lots of people have the ability to block those lines. So that's been a challenge, but generally we've had sufficient generation capacity to service the demand for electricity.
So the paid back money is not completely kind of burden on consumers, but government provides some guarantees and it makes things much easier.
Well, I'm sorry if maybe it's a little bit confusing. I started by talking about these so-called guaranteed prices, and that's really not that's been the case for renewable projects in Europe, and it is what happens in the United States, the so-called regulated markets, where essentially you get a guaranteed rate of return. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
I hope that's clear.
Yeah.
Good.
That's clear.
Professor, what do you think about the role of nuclear power in emerging economies? You know, as I said, I'm from Kazakhstan, and it's very valuable for me and for my fellow Kazakh people to know unbiased opinion. I mean, professional opinion on the power, on the nuclear power.
I've never visited your wonderful country. I'd love to visit your country.
Yeah.
And I don't know the situation in Kazakhstan, so I can't speak to that specifically.
Yeah.
But let me speak about nuclear power in general. I think nuclear power in general has some tremendous advantages, in particular from a pollution standpoint. Nuclear power provides zero carbon, power, almost zero carbon power, no local air pollution. And it also has a track record of safety. We've now had more than 50 years of experience with civil nuclear power. And there have been a few accidents, but they've been pretty extraordinary circumstances. And the track record of safety of nuclear power, for example, as compared to coal-fired power, is amazing. I mean, coal-fired power kills thousands of people. Every year, many thousands of people from the pollution that it causes. Nuclear power does not do that. So nuclear power has some big advantages. It has two principal disadvantages. The first is that it's expensive. And particularly in comparison to renewable power like solar and wind, which is also low carbon, nuclear power is just much more expensive today. The second is that public acceptance is very low. Around the world, we find significant portions of the public, it's scared by nuclear power. There's a lot of opposition. So those are very big issues. So whether or not a nation proceeds with nuclear power, that's in its own sovereign decisions. It depends upon a variety of factors, including what the alternatives are, what the public opinion is. But there's almost no energy source in my experience that has kind of stronger strengths that are really important, but also some real challenges or weaknesses. But they're both there with nuclear power.
Professor, in 2007 you wrote a book, Freedom from Oil, which proposes ways to reduce their dependence of the United States on oil. If your proposals were realized until today, maybe the economy of the United States could be in much better condition. Almost 15 years have passed, and What are your thoughts now on those proposals?
In that book, I particularly focused on electric vehicles, which I thought at the time were particularly promising. And it's been very satisfying for me to see the growth in the electric vehicle market in just the past couple of years. I don't know about Kazakhstan, but in the United States and in much of Europe and in China, we've seen huge growth in the number of electric vehicles on the road, like 60, 70, 80% growth last year. And now we find that automobile manufacturers around the world are coming out with new models for electric vehicles. And I think this is a very encouraging development in a number of ways. It's going to help in terms of pollution, global warming. And electric cars are also just great products. They're fun to drive. They're quiet. They go very fast. They have great pickup. That was a major issue that I talked about in that book, and it's really fun to see the developments there. That book was written before the U.S. shale gas revolution. And so back at that time, one of the major goals in the United States was to reduce our dependence on oil imports. And nobody, or very few people at the time that book was written, saw the possibility that the United States would be dramatically increasing its oil production. So it's been interesting for me to go back and look at that book because just the world changed in some ways that it wasn't expected after that book was written.
Do you have any thoughts about writing the second version of that book for the next president?
I haven't thought about that, but that's a very interesting idea. It's a very interesting idea.
Professor, we talked about nuclear, about natural gas, about solar. So I would like to ask a question about coal power stations. So now, currently, we see that really high price for gas. And what do you think about the coal power plants right now? Is there any options which could produce clean energy by burning coal?
It's possible to build coal-fired power generation where almost all the pollution is captured, including the carbon dioxide. There's really no commercial plants in the world operating today that are doing that. And I think new coal-fired power plants are going to be one of the biggest issues with respect to climate change. And if we have any chance of meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, the world needs to stop building coal-fired power plants, or be sure that every coal-fired power plant fully captures its carbon dioxide. But I think that's a really difficult order. And I think today, renewable power with storage is probably, in most situations, going to be a better alternative. So coal-fired power is just one of the biggest health threats in the world. And this is a challenge because I think we're very good, human beings are very good at responding to threats that happen immediately. You know, if somebody's standing outside and threatening you, like kind of we know how to handle that. But for a threat like a coal-fired power plant, which takes many, many years before it kills people, we just aren't as good at responding to that. So there's very strong data in many places in the world, including China, which I study, about how many people die as a result of pollution from coal. And it's awful. Children's lives children become sick, people die earlier, they lead more, much less healthy lives. But we keep building coal-fired power plants because we just don't, it's not as tangible, it's not as quick, it's not as immediate. So I think the fewer, the coal-fired power plants are still under construction in some places of the world. The fewer that we can build, the better, I think.
Thank you, Professor. It was very interesting. You provide very, I think you gave us food for thought. So it will be very helpful for many people. Thank you, Professor.
It was my honor to join you. Thank you.